he was a literary giant. One of the most awarded American writers of his generation. Philip Roth, born in Newark, New Jersey in 1933. Roth gained fame almost immediately after his first book, Goodbye Columbus, was published in 1959, when he was just 26 years old. The work sold tens of thousands of copies and received the National Book Award. His career would go on to span more than 5 decades and include over 30 books, a Pulitzer Prize, 3 PEN/Faulkner Awards, the National Humanities Medal, the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction, and the Lifetime Literary Achievement Award, among many others. Several of his works were made into movies.
Because I'm afraid of my nose.
What?
I had it fixed.
Yeah? What was the matter with it?
It's bumpy.
A lot?
No. I was pretty, and now I'm prettier. My brother's having his fixed in the fall.
Does he want to be prettier? Sorry. I don't mean to sound facetious, but why is he doing it?
Because he wants to.
Police have widened their search for the missing teenager, Meredith Laval, for her involvement in the bombing of a post office.
Where is she? I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. Find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world.
Do they exist, or are they spooks? Consider the context.
But Dean...
I've not finished! The only issue is the non-attendance of these students, their inexcusable neglect of work, and their sheer chutzpah. Oh, Miss Cummings is devastated. Give me a break, will you? To charge me with racism is not only false, it is spectacularly false. And you know it! Thanks a lot, Herb.
Although Roth is revered as a satirical genius with an incomparable gift for the written word, his repertoire of work was not without controversy or criticism. His reputation for addressing themes of Jewish identity and cultural assimilation were viewed as harsh by many in the Jewish community. And his 1969 novel, Portnoy's Complaint, a story rife with dark humor and explicit sexuality, was proclaimed by many as blasphemous and profane. It was also responsible for catapulting his career. All of his books were, according to Roth, works of fiction, but many of his readers believed that he was simply writing his own story for 50 years. His Zuckerman series, narrated by a novelist named Nathan Zuckerman, closely parallels Roth's own life and is believed to be an alter ego. Whether his characters and stories were based on his personal life or not, Roth was without a doubt one of the most prolific writers of all time. Here's a look at his remarkable life and career.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage co-chairs Lee Wolf and Emmy Award winner Stephen Karras.
You know, yesterday I had the pleasure of going to the new Norton, which I think is quite amazing. It's beautiful. And I came upon this room with spectacular paintings by a woman named Nina Chanel Abney. And I noted something that she said, and I thought, oh my God, I have to write this down and share it with the audience because it really is what Philip Roth is all about. And when we talk about these books that may or may not offend some of you, keep this in mind. And she said, artists have a right to do whatever they want. It is creative license, so why not use it? Push the boundaries. That's what art should do. Make people uncomfortable, but in a good way, a good uncomfortable. And we will say that I can remember, when we'll talk a little bit about Sabbath Theater, it was the only time that I actually shut a book and said, I can't go on. But anyway, he certainly was a writer who freed himself and freed us, I would say. He wrote over 30 books. He had 5 of his books made into films: Goodbye Columbus, Portnoy's Complaint, The Human Stain, American Pastoral, and Ghostwriter. And as you saw in the film, he won just about every literary award possible, except the Nobel Prize, which I think he, in my humble opinion, deserved. And he would say that every time they announced the Nobel Prize, his agent would say, I'm going to call you if you win it. Just go to sleep, and if you hear the phone ring at 4 a.m, you know you won it. Well, the phone never rang at 4 a.m. He was born in Newark in 1933, and he died in New York last year. But he never really left Newark. So many of his books mirror that Jewish experience, particularly his youth, and I don't know how to pronounce this, so the New Jerseyans will have to tell me. I don't know whether it's Wequahic, or Wequahic. What? Wequahic. Thank you, New Jerseyites. Wequake. Well, whatever. Anyway, it was a totally Jewish neighborhood. And when he talks about writing, he never cared about his audience. He said, I didn't care. What he cared about was sentence. He'd start with the word, the sentence, the paragraph. And that's what he thought about the words of writing. But he also said his goal in writing was to make himself more visible to himself. And I think he was pretty obsessed and fascinated with not only himself, but with his life. I mean, he was accused of so many people of being a literary narcissist. And he's called, and I think rightly so, the Lenny Bruce of the printed page. And he insisted, although he was called a Jewish writer, he said, I am not a Jewish writer. I'm an American writer. I don't write in Jewish. I write in American. And as you saw in the film, again, he appeared again and again in his novels, in his alter egos, Zuckerman, Kepish, Tarnopol, and in his most distinctive works. And I think this was where we saw his genius, because he merged reality and fiction. And as we will discuss in some of his books, he did this brilliantly, so that you really aren't quite sure what is real and what is not. Okay. He could never get outside of Newark. And he wrote about it. He tried to get outside. He said he wanted to run away from Newark. But he wasn't successful, because he wrote about it for the rest of his life.
Well, the fact and fiction element in many people's books, he said, I have to start with facts. Otherwise, there's nowhere to go from there. As a person myself who did not excel in academics in high school, I had to flirt with my 9th grade math teacher to get a D. And he wasn't gay, and I didn't know what I was. He just couldn't, and I was worse in English, so imagine the report card. But when I started to read Philip Roth, the sentence structure, the paragraph sentence, for someone like me who paid no attention in academics, the choreography of the work is so divine. He makes a statement, he justifies it, he ponders it, he discusses it with himself, and then there's a resolve. The sentences are endless, but for me, to follow the way he writes is a breakthrough. I mean, that's just a justification that the genius
Well, may
of
I say,
his
I don't
work.
mean to interrupt, but for someone who says that he was not a good student, you are the fastest study I know.
I wouldn't
I've been studying literature my whole life, and you know as much about Philip Roth as I do, I think.
My teacher, Mr. Nagel, would not agree with you. But let's jump into his life. He went to Rutgers for a year at 16, and he had to change because he was living at home then. It wasn't so far from Warwick neighborhood. Okay, yeah, we'll settle out of court on that pronunciation. But his father was a pain. His father was fearful that he was becoming an independent young man, so he was more of a royal pain in the ass, as he referred to him. So off to Bucknell he went at 17, interested at first in becoming a lawyer, justice, the underdog. But soon after that, Lee, he decided he wanted to write. How did that evolve?
Well, first let me say that as far as running away from Newark and his parents, he spoke, everyone said he spoke so lovingly and beautifully about them and cared very much for them. But he had this great desire to be free and independent. And he found his place at Bucknell. He had a wonderful teacher, a professor, a woman who saw in him talent, great talent. And she inspired him to write. When he got there, the Jewish boy from Bush, got there, wherever that was, got there and immediately joined SAMI, Sigma Alpha Mu, and was part of this whole group of Jewish boys. But he did not want that identity and left the fraternity with two other friends, and they founded this literary magazine. And this is where he started to write and to think about himself as a writer. But he said what happened was that he wrote as though he were the lord of some English manor, not from McClockett or whatever. He wrote as though he was and he said the stuff was crappy. It was awful stuff. But he was starting to get his voice.
He was passionate about it from the beginning. What was the subject matter? What were the subject matters of that literary magazine?
Downton Abbey, I think.
Anything but Jewish, right?
Anything but Jewish.
Right.
I mean, he was trying to divest himself of that moniker,
He went into the Army shortly afterwards.
He did,
was young.
shortly after college, and he became ill and was discharged early. And then he went off to the University of Chicago to get his master's. He ultimately became an instructor. But it was really in the Army that he found his true voice. It was there that his voice as a novelist emerged. And what was that voice? That voice came from the echoes of Newark, of New Jersey, of his Jewish experience.
Right. Then he moved to Chicago. He got his master's rather quickly at the University of Chicago. He started teaching writing at a very young age because he did go to Rutgers at 16. He got a head start on college as a very young man. But being in Chicago with all of this good stuff happening academically and professionally was really the agony and the ecstasy for him, because this is where he met his nemesis. Some people know this, I guess some people don't. This shiksa by the name of Margaret Martinson. It's a word he used more than once in his books. And then he married her.
And then he married that
her.
woman, his nemesis.
She had some issues, no?
And it gave him fodder for what he produced literarily later on in life. She was a waitress that he eyed. I mean, he liked those pretty ladies, and we will see one of them. Anyway, she was a waitress, and then she took one of his classes. And she was a very troubled woman from a very troubled background. She was 2 years older than he. At 19, she had her first child. And when he met her, she had 2 children living with her husband out west somewhere who had abused her. Her father was an alcoholic. So, and then what did she do, Steve?
Well, she tricked him into marrying her because it wasn't going to work otherwise. So she actually took a trip to a challenged neighborhood and bought urine from a pregnant hooker to prove that she was pregnant through the doctor.
To him, so he would
and
marry
it worked.
her.
It wasn't, but he married her as a result of that. So she was clever. We have to give her that.
Well,
She
so
thought
clever.
outside of the box.
She sure did, or in it. But anyway, she also, he didn't want a child. They were young. I mean, he was a young man. He was launching a career. And so she told him she would have an abortion. He said, "I'll marry you if you have an abortion." So he gave her some
believe this?
money.
Yep.
And she went off to the movies to see I Want to Live. Remember Susan Hayward's great film?
That was the abortion.
And she did want to live,
It
I
was
guess.
a very
and so,
inexpensive
yeah.
abortion.
And so she pocketed the money, and
Right.
that was that.
He was about 26 now, all right, 1959. He wrote several short stories, Defender of the Faith, Epstein, and the novella Goodbye Columbus.
And it caused quite a furor. Because in these 3 books, there was in Epstein, there's a Jewish adulterer. The Defender of the Faith, there were Jewish boys who were in the army who were gaming the system. And of course, in Goodbye Columbus, there was Brenda and the diaphragm and the garish Jewish family. It was not a very pretty picture of Jews. And to his very naive surprise, there was a Jewish backlash. There was a hostile reaction from rabbis, from the general Jewish community, and they condemned him for writing about Jewish whores and Jewish adulterers, to which the very clever Philip Roth replied, "What should I write about? Portuguese whores and Portuguese adulterers?" So that he started at that point really to have somewhat of a battle that continued with both the rabbis and the Jewish community.
Right, and it really, not much surprised him, but that did. But he was naive and still very young. And after this, he didn't immediately produce anything he was ever quite proud of, to say the least. It, of course, had to do in part with this messed up marriage that he was in, that blurred his artistic vision in some ways.
Well,
but,
he wrote
right?
literally nothing between 62 and 67 after this tremendous success, particularly with Goodbye Columbus and being made into a movie. It was really quite a coup. But he said, I just wrote crap.
Yeah.
It was terrible. He said, but I was in the throes of this bad, brutal marriage, and I felt derailed, and my confidence had been shot. And it's interesting about Philip Roth. He was very honest. He was brutally honest. He no holds barred, and yet he only spoke about this marriage as being brutal, as being hellish. He never went into detail, and he gets into detail about everything else. But he was really in the throes of both a personal and a literary crisis. And so he went to do what any good Jewish boy would do. He went to see a psychiatrist. And this was in about 1967. And out of this experience, this psychiatric experience, it was the catalyst for what became his breakout book. And I think with all the fantastic literature that he has written, this is his signature book in terms of his visibility. And I'm sure you know what we're talking about. Exactly. Thank you for all your help. Portnoy's Complaint, right.
There was a statement of his discomfort of being a Jewish boy. That's a subtle way of putting it. The classic Oedipal story, this with his mother, this interaction. Alex, his character, is trapped with all the rules and the restrictions within that family, with the high kvetching from both the parents. His only outlet as a result, for those of you who remember, read the book, saw the film, is masturbation. And in the most creative possible ways, and I use the word creative in quotes because it doesn't mean it's all that inspiring for everyone who knows all of his clever ways. But his parents would be at the dinner table. The father, I haven't had a bowel movement in 8 months, I'm dying. And the mother like, my son. And he would get up from the table and walk into the bathroom 5 feet away and get creative and use props. And it was in 1969, it was, of course, Woodstock, the Love Generation. Still, I mean, to read that, it's one thing to
what about the liver story? I'm not going to talk about that specifically,
yes.
But use your imagination. He didn't. I mean, he just, as I say, but he was, through that, I mean, he was influenced by Saul Bellow and Augie March, and he said that what Portnoy's complaint did was that it freed him, totally freed him as a novelist.
Well, thanks for sharing all that information that none of us were really dying to know about. This character, Alex, but it was a huge hit. What puzzles me about this man who has been preoccupied with sexuality his entire life and at childhood, we are accused, the males, of having our brains downstairs somewhere. I don't know, with all of that preoccupation with sex, that had any brains left to write the way he did. I did not go to college, so I don't know the answer to this.
How brainy he was.
So after the book was published, he was invited to a literary forum at, was it Yeshiva University?
It was at Yeshiva University, yeah.
With 2 other authors, Ellison and D. Donato.
Donato, yeah.
And he experienced even fiercer backlash from this. Gee, I wonder why. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, again, he went to this forum thinking the 3 men would be speaking about their respective books. And, of course, we know Ellison's Great Invisible Man. Well, nobody in that audience was the least interested in that story. And all they did was pummel him with questions. And one man got up and he said, if you were in Nazi Germany, would you have written a book like this? And he said only the questions were directed at him. And he felt, he really felt assaulted. And Ralph Ellison came to his defense because his feeling was, as I read to you at the very beginning of our discussion, that the writer should be free to write about whatever he wants. And in an interview, he said, what's the fuss about? We all have sex. We all like sex. We talk about sex. What's the problem?
Well, it's usually behind a closed door somewhere, not for everybody to read about. And he felt as an artist, he can express what, and artists do, express what it is they want to express.
And you write what you know about.
And he writes beautifully, and that's an understatement.
But that breakout novel, despite the fact that it was quite scatological, he still sold 350,000 copies immediately. Right. And it became the #1 bestseller.
Right.
And I just have to share this story, Steve, because I love this story. But when Portnoy's complaint came out, he knew that everyone was going to think that his mother and his father were the prototypes for the parents. And so what he did is he sent them on a cruise. And so, Jewish son, he sent them on a cruise, and his father brought 12 of the books with him. And he went around, he said, my son wrote this book to all these, he only had 12. And then he signed the book, Philip Roth's father, and gave it, and he wished that he had had more.
Yes.
And the other story is that his mother came back to see him after, she went to a Hadassah meeting, and she said, Philip, I just came back from a Hadassah meeting, and all the women were saying that you're an anti-Semite. Philip, tell me, are you an anti-Semite? And he said, Mother, what do you think? No, I'm not. Oh, good. And he said, he at this interview, he said, if I had told her I was an anti-Semite, I would have been the best anti-Semite in the world. And what Portnoy's complaint also did was that it awakened in him his penchant for humor and mimicry. That's what made him so popular, and he was. I mean, he was handsome and bright and funny and interesting, and he was a very popular fellow. And he thought about it. He said it occurred to him that this humor could be transferred on to the written page and used as a literary device. And this is what, when I said that Portnoy freed him in so many ways, it opened up his humorous side, aside from, you know, his intellectual side. And this humor and this scatology and this freedom resulted in Sabbath's Theater. I don't know how many of you have ever read it. It's the book I told you that I closed. And this is the case, and I'm going to let you tell this.
Oh,
Steve.
thanks.
You're welcome.
Here I go again. Yes, I'm the below sea level subject speaker.
No, darling, you're the
that's-
man.
No, okay. So Sabbath, the character Mr. Sabbath in this, and at his late wife's grave, at the grave, fulfilled yet another sexual fantasy. At the grave. Thank you, Lee, for giving me that information to share with everybody. Use your imagination, that's as far as we're going to go, but my goodness, that wasn't one of his funnier books.
No, but this is the point. And what he did was to shock you.
Well, he said
again,
to write well, you have to be shameless.
Yeah.
And when I sit down to write, I am shame-free.
That's exactly it.
So,
And as I said earlier, he wrote not for the audience. I mean,
Obviously, yeah.
I mean, he was
He thought
very
about the book.
insular in that way.
he said it's about the book.
It's about the
Where
book.
Ballinger would say it's about the music. The rest of us had just followed, but it was about the music, not about him, not about his reviews. And then in the midst of all of this success that he has had, leading up to it and otherwise, is Margaret, still the wife. They'd separated in 1963, divorced several years later, but she remained the albatross extraordinaire over the next 5 years, always trying to get money out of him. She even went to his parents. Just picture Glenn Close, Fatal Attraction. Without the perm, same thing. Until this accident in 1968, this unexpected accident. Lee, tell us about her daughter from her first marriage calling Philip to say my
well, her
mother's had
daughter
an
was
accident.
then living with her, and she called Philip in a panic, and she said to him, my mother was killed. My mother is dead. And it turned out that she was driving with a colleague in Central Park, and she put her hands on the wheel and tried to, and did crash. The driver was not killed, but she was. And Philip, and actually in Portnoy's complaint, he does have that episode when he was with Margaret on the Riviera or something, and she took the wheel. They had an argument. She took the wheel and tried to make him crash.
Right.
And so when the daughter told him that indeed Margaret was dead, he thought it was a hoax because she had tricked him into marrying. He thought this is some scheme of hers. But indeed, it was not a hoax. She was, in fact, dead. And here again, his truthfulness, his candor. Yeah. He writes in his biography how he was singing. He was figuring out now what is he going to do with all that money he's going to save now that she's dead. And he was so excited. And he said, I could not believe my good fortune.
Couldn't have scripted it better.
Could not have,
Right. Yeah. Was he dating
How soon after?
Soon after, or did it take a while for him to?
No, it didn't at all. He was dating while he was married to her. Oh. I mean, he had a string of ladies.
Mm-hmm. Well, aside of being accused of a misogynist and an anti-Semite, I mean, what else was there?
There are a few things in between.
Yeah, well, only in his literature, however, right?
He was accused in his literature,
in his
the
literature.
way he depicted women, right?
Mm-hmm. So, what about this? Tell us about this book.
Well, there is a book, and I'm sure many of you have read it in your book clubs, Asymmetry, but it is a Romana clef, and indeed, this was written by one of his younger ladies. I think she was in her 20s and he was in his 70s. All the men in the audience are panting at this moment. She was sort of servicing, what?
All 6 of them.
All 6 of them? There are more.
No, there's more today.
There are more today. No, but this young, sweet woman, she writes about, she sort of was servicing, doing service to him. Mm-hmm. And of course it was on his terms, as all things were. Mm-hmm. But this was the rub. He paid all of her college debts, without telling her. And she found out about it later, that she was called by the university to tell her that she was no longer in debt. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about his being a misogynist, when he was in hospice and he was dying, there were 48 people that stood vigil, 18 of whom were women. Mm-hmm. Several intimates, several colleagues, but he had some very, very close relationships, particularly with very intellectual women, collegial relationships with women. Mm-hmm.
So Lee, he's around 36 now after the Portnoy, and he's divorced, and he's overnight famous. He said, now I can buy a house, I can buy a car, I can do all these wonderful things that can come with having a little pocket change. But it wasn't necessarily, I read, a comfy fit for him being a celebrity, and he needed an escape. He was in Manhattan, but he found Woodstock for a while, but he wound up buying a place in Connecticut, which was a place he loved to get away to and write. But he wasn't a J.D. Salinger in that he was a complete recluse, correct?
No, he wasn't. Everything was on his terms. I mean, I repeat myself, but it's absolutely true. He bought this enclave in Connecticut, and when he wanted, he would go there, he'd write, when he wanted solace, he had solace. When he wanted to bring people in, I mean, he wasn't like Salinger that locked himself up. He still interacted. He still had his friends come but he led a very austere life.
I love what he said, yeah.
Well, you'll say it, but I just want to finish this one thing.
Go ahead, go.
Okay. That he said, he had no children, and his day began with work, exercise, sleep, and that was it.
Right.
He worked, he exercised, he slept, and he said,
well, I devote one day a year to frivolity.
Yeah, one day a year.
But I'm not sure that was
his,
true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was true from.
Well, it's interesting because here was such a complex, conflicted, complicated man.
Right.
Yes, he was austere, but I must tell you, he had the most incredible intellectual sense of humor, a black sense of humor. Mm-hmm. When I was rereading Portnoy, I had to share with Jordan. I mean, because I didn't want to it was too much fun. And so I started reading passages to him, and I could never finish the sentence because I just got these paroxysms of laughter. I couldn't stop. If you want to have a lot of fun, go read the book.
Well, Lee, he said his greatest joy and his greatest burden were his work, but that's not unusual for an artist. However, he did have a competing joy, correct?
Right.
The ladies.
The ladies, as they said in Hamilton.
Hamlet. Hamilton.
Remember, ladies? I can't sing. Go on.
That was okay. We'll get back to you. I have to tell you a story briefly related to this. About 2 months ago, I got a message from a lovely woman who was writing on behalf of her mother. It came through my website. And her mother was someone that had a summer romance with Philip Roth in 1952, 1953. They met at the Pocono Highlands camp, if any of you know where that was. He was 19, she was younger. I got in touch with her. She had a ticket to come to this event. Her name is Mickey Auerbach, Auerbach, and she had several letters from him. Can you imagine having letters from Philip Roth? And they were typewritten, and she shared them with us, and I read them a week or so ago when I met her in person. We got together. And his writing talent at 19 was so divine and so apparent, and they were typewritten, and he apologized, of course, in his way. He has to justify the sentence from before. I'm typing because I can express myself a lot faster at a typewriter and much better than if I'm writing in longhand. These are her divine keepsakes, and mind you, they were very young. And she wrote him a note in their correspondence. And it was rather innocent because I think it was like in Funny Girl, you know, when Nicky Arnstein visits Barbra Streisand a couple times, you know, Fanny Bryce, but she's not quite ready for the romance. So this was the sort of not quite ready, but they were very romantic regardless. And she wrote him a note saying, asking, how can I become more of an intellectual? So back comes a list, and it was entitled, How to Make Mickey an Intellectual. And these are kids, you know. No more kids are talking about this today. I mean, maybe they are. I haven't met those 4 people yet. And here's some of the names. Thomas Wolfe, Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, Truman Capote, George Bernard Shaw, Tennyson, Shelley, and Wordsworth, to name a few. Her memories of him, his dashing good looks, his great confidence are as clear as day to this day. And but she's rather private about the details, and I can understand that. She's divine, and you'll meet her in 1 sec. But after much prodding, she admitted that he was a great kisser. So I got that out of her, which is something.
All
and
this
that
in heaven, too.
And then she, you know, when he was writing back to her and saying, well, you know, maybe now, well, I'm sorry, I've already met the man I'm going to marry. But she also admitted that he looked a lot like Philip Roth, okay? So she's here, and I want to ask her to stand and turn that way. So if we have a light. I want you to see, it's very easy to know how he fell in love with this woman.
Absolutely.
Here she is, Mickey Auerbach. Just
Mickey?
Thank you for sharing your letters with us. Yes. There she is. And she's my new friend.
He loved beautiful women. There's
She's-
no
yeah.
doubt about
so
that.
So there's the proof. There's the proof. So Lee?
Okay, so now we're going to jump to 1975. And he's a long way away from summer camp. And he meets the beautiful, talented actress Claire Bloom, British actress. And therein began a 20-year relationship, culminating in a 5-year marriage, which lasted until from 1990 to 1995.
Mm-hmm. And then they lived in London for a while, right? But he was not happy there, maybe 5 years. So back they came, New York and Connecticut. She with him, correct?
And yes, she came with him. And there were really 20 very turbulent years. In 1996, a year after their divorce, she wrote a book called Leaving the Doll's House. And it was a scathing indictment of both Roth and their marriage. And when you read her side of the story, you can understand why she had this animus and why she felt this way. It was a very turbulent relationship. It was Roth who asked for the divorce in '94. A year before he divorced her, he had a very serious mental breakdown. And I did not know that. And evidently he had a couple of these breakdowns. And this particular one, which was quite dramatic, was attributed to his use of Halcyon. Remember Halcyon? I think it preceded Valium as the drug of choice. And it was during another extended illness of his that they prescribed the Halcyon. And when he had this breakdown, he turned his back on Claire, and he turned to his brother Sandy, his older brother Sandy, and asked him to come and help him. And this is very indicative of the fact that he never quite grew up, I really felt. With all his brilliance, with all his intellectuality, with all of this, there was the boy in him, the boy whose mother had him snuggle in her seal coat, the boy who was so beloved and revered by his parents, the boy who could never quite leave Newark. And so in his time of need, he turned not to his wife, but to his brother. And he left her. And the saddest thing is that she begged him not to leave him, on her hands and knees. And she writes that she was on her hands and knees saying, please, please, don't leave me. And her relationship with him, her marriage, her relationship was marked mostly by her making all kinds of painful concessions and compromises, and including, I think, something that it's very hard for me to imagine a mother doing. But she had a one and only daughter who later became an opera singer, actually, and she was the daughter of Rod Steiger. That was Bloom's previous husband. Right. And what she did is she farmed her out to her mother because Roth did not want her living with them. He found her very distracting. And so she gave up her daughter, in a sense. They later reconciled to a degree. But at the end of the divorce, the end of this 20-year relationship, he left her with $100,000 and no place to live.
And the next year,
her book came out.
Her book about them came out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
No Holds Barred.
No Holds Barred. And his book, I Married a Communist, sort of got back at her a little bit.
Right. Yes. Subtle title there.
Yeah.
So subsequent to the breakdown, he emerges like a phoenix. It was rather rapid, no?
In the 90s, he wrote what was considered to be 3 of his best novels, well, 2 really, that were considered really breakthrough, great novels. And they encompassed the Vietnam War, that era, the McCarthy era, and the Clinton era. And that was American Pastoral, I Married a Communist, and The Human Stain. And in The Human Stain, again, both the fiction and fact and his dark humor emerge, because the central character is a man who's an African American who poses as a Jew. Now, I want to ask you, okay, you have your choice. Anyway, he becomes a Jewish professor at a Williams-like university. And so in reading this novel, you can see that his imagination has not deserted him. But then, in 2005, he writes The Plot Against America. And it was, and it still is, scarily clairvoyant. And it's emerged as a very popular novel, re-emerged today.
Again. Well, originally, when it first was published, Frank Rich said very emphatically that this was an allegory in reference to the Bush administration.
Right.
And Roth flat out denied it.
Absolutely.
But now people are saying the same thing about the current administration.
About Trump. They say that this was very prescient, and that the character, and we'll give you a little synopsis of the book so you can see why, that there is a great deal of truth in this. And they said that this was the one that foreshadowed the emergence of a Trump-like figure as president of the United States.
Basically, it's if Lindbergh had been elected as president versus FDR. And so it unfolds with all of the connection of the administration with the Nazis, and this is back in the 40s.
Well, Lindbergh was considered to be very amenable to Hitler and to the Germans, and by many he was called a fascist. Mm-hmm. And so what Roth imagines is that this cult of celebrity, that through this cult of celebrity, this young, handsome, brave man becomes president, defeats Roosevelt to become president of the United States, and is in cahoots with the Nazis. And what subsequently occurs is that the Jews are sent to these enclaves in the South and the Midwest, and there the idea is to kind of deconstruct these Jews and to diminish their Judaism and to have them assimilate. But the one problem with the novel is that there's a very rapid denouement, and all of a sudden Roosevelt becomes president, and Lindbergh is lost. Amelia Earhart is lost in his plane. He takes off in his plane, and he's somehow never seen again. But I recommend it. It's very interesting. There are so many parallels, including fake news. So there's a lot of that.
What's interesting to note is that the growth in his writing, or the difference, depending on it's all based on his family is involved in this. And the narrator is Philip, is an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old boy.
It's Philip Roth, 9-year-old.
And it's Philip. So it's his family living this. And the kvetching parents from the early humor turn into very different, very serious, heroic parents.
Exactly.
And they're depicted so beautifully, I think, in that book.
And of course, in this book, he uses his family's rightful names and his own.
Yeah.
And of course, his father, interestingly enough, becomes sort of the hero of that book.
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Towards the end of his career, he wrote a series of novellas involving illness, death, despair, the travails of aging. So he's mirroring his life. In the beginning, he was playing with himself and whatever girl he could get his hands on, and then into the social issues. And now, oh my God, I'm hurting, and it's the end of my life, where I'm headed towards it, right?
That's right. And he was very ill in those years, but also as a writer, what he was attempting to do something new. And that was to write in the novella form. He had seen other writers do this, Updike and people that he admired, and he wanted to challenge himself because he had never done that before, and wrote these series of very depressing books. The last book he wrote was in 2010 called Nemesis. And again, he goes back to Newark, imagines a polio epidemic hitting the Newark area, and the summer camp was really a depiction of Mickey's experience with Roth in that summer camp. So going back once again to the well of his youth and his past. But he said, after writing Nemesis, I am not ever going to write again. I am finished. I have done what I had to do. I have written what I've wanted to write, and I'm finished. And he was true to his word. He never wrote again, never wrote a book again.
Right.
And his last years were marked by very serious illnesses.
Right.
But these illnesses, as you will see in Asymmetry, didn't stop him from doing what he loved most. He was very creative.
Next to writing, of course.
Next to writing, exactly. Next to writing.
Yeah.
And he said?
Well, has anyone seen the documentary about him? It's quite wonderful, and it's findable. In the opening, he said this: in the coming years, I have 2 great calamities, death and a biography. Let's hope the first comes first.
And it did. And it did. Thank you so much.
Thank
You've
you,
been
everybody.
a wonderful audience.
Thanks.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.